to Jesus Christ.
Lord, forever.
Today, which is a Sunday that follows the Nativity, we have two different feasts that we celebrate. We celebrate the feast of St. Basil the Great, who's remembered on January 1st. Today is January 1st on the old calendar. And then we have the feast of the circumcision of Christ, because that was accomplished on the 8th day, and today is the 8th day after the Nativity. And so our two gospel readings reflect these two different feasts. The first reading that we heard was from Mark, and it was entitled "The Beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God," and then immediately goes into a description of John the Baptist. Now, it seems a strange way to begin a book that's entitled "The Beginning of the Gospel of Jesus Christ," and then we immediately start talking about John the Baptist, the voice of one crying in the wilderness, the one sent beforehand to prepare the world for the coming of Christ. And that's how Mark begins his gospel. And it's interesting because to the vast majority of the world, the ministry of Christ was known only after his baptism by John. That was the beginning of his public ministry. So though it might seem strange that we begin the Gospel of Mark talking first about John the Baptist, that is, in fact, how most of the world came to know Christ, is in the events of his baptism and what followed. So perhaps it makes sense that we start the gospel that way. But that also leaves us with a very huge gap, because when Christ comes to John for baptism, he's already about 30 years old. And if we look at the Gospel of Mark, Christ just appears out of nowhere for the baptism. A little bit like we read about Melchizedek in the Old Testament, the mysterious king who appears offering the bread and the wine, seemingly out of nowhere, no parentage known. But in Mark, Christ shows up, fully formed adult, prepared for his baptism. But of course, as we know from the readings we've had leading up to and on Nativity, that was not the whole story. Because we have the Nativity story, which we've read in various gospel readings coming up to the season. And that's our second gospel, is somewhat the ending of the Nativity story. Luke begins with the shepherds return, glorifying and praising God for all the things that they had heard and seen. That was sort of the ending of the Nativity story. But then we have the gospel reading from Luke for today. And it's not exactly wrong to say that this gospel reading that we have today from Luke is essentially the story of Christ's life after his birth but before his baptism. Because we really don't have much of a record in the gospel other than what is read today. We know that on the 8th day he was circumcised, as was the custom of the Jews for every male child. We know that he was named Jesus, as was foretold by the angel as he was being conceived. And we hear one other little story, and that is the story of Christ when he is 12 years old, going down to Jerusalem with his parents. We know that the parents of Christ, Joseph and Mary, were very observant, very pious Jews, and we're told that every year they went to Jerusalem for the Passover. And it wasn't just the four of them or the three of them would hop in a car and drive down to Jerusalem. No, there's no such easy way. But they would go in a big company with family and with neighbors. And they would go down to Jerusalem. They'd attend the Feast of the Passover, and then they'd come back. And the story that we hear, Christ is 12 years old, and they go down for the Feast of the Passover, their big company of neighbors and kinfolk, and they celebrate the feast, and they prepare to return, and back they go. And Joseph and Mary believe that Christ is with the rest of the group. And they travel an entire day, and they come to rest, and they say, "Where's Jesus?" And they ask their relatives, and they ask their neighbors who are traveling with them, and none of them know where he is. And you can imagine, as a parent, what that must feel like. You've traveled for 12 hours, and now you realize your child's missing. He never got in the car. He never got on with the group that was traveling up and back to Nazareth. And so they turn around and they go back to Jerusalem. And after 3 days, they find him in the temple, sitting in the midst of the teachers, both asking and answering questions. And everybody that's listening to this 12-year-old boy teaching in the temple is astonished with his understanding and his answers. But while his parents were likewise amazed at what he was doing, they weren't exactly pleased about it. And so they gave Jesus a little talking to and said, "How can you do this to me? Don't you know that we've been worried about you?" And Jesus says an answer that, if another 12 or 13-year-old gave it to his parents, might be perceived as kind of a smart-ass answer. He says, "Why are you worried about me? Don't you know I have to be about my Father's business?" And when Jesus says it, there's a truth to it. But don't you try giving that answer to your parents. Or we're told they go back to Nazareth, and at that point, he is subject to his parents. If you give that answer to your parents, you might be subject to them right then and there. And this is about all we know of the life of Christ between his nativity and his baptism. And the baptism of Christ, which is called the Theophany of Christ, we will celebrate with Vespers on Thursday evening and the feast on Friday morning. Unfortunately, we don't have any running water, so we'll just have to bless the water in here. The creeks are dry, I'm afraid. But the gospel reading today is nothing less than the proof of the humanity of the Christ. He took on flesh. We know that in the nativity story. He lived with his parents. He grew and increased, we're told, in wisdom and stature, and found favor with God and man. So he's born a baby. He grows into a young man. Even like most 12-year-olds, is not the easiest time around the household. Now, Christ's intentions may be better than most 12 and 13-year-olds, but still, we see a family dynamic. He's subject to them. He is under their rule as parents, even though God is subject to nobody except that he chooses to be. It is proof of the condescension of Christ to humanity. He lives in a family. He's disciplined within the family. He grows. He does everything any human child would do. And so this reading is given to us as additional proof of the humanity of Christ, because on the theophany, what will be revealed is the divinity of Christ. When Christ is baptized and the Spirit descends in the form of the dove, and those there hear the words of God, "This is my beloved Son." So as we prepare to celebrate the theophany, we are reminded of the humanity of Christ, because the incarnation is an absolute necessity to our salvation. God must take on that which he will redeem. And God clothed himself in every ounce of human fiber that he might redeem our sinful nature through his own faultless nature. So brothers and sisters, as we prepare for the theophany, let us remember final time the nativity of Christ, the incarnation, God taking on flesh for our salvation. Let us be edified by the words of the holy evangelist Luke on the humanity of Christ. In the name of the Father and Son and the Holy Spirit, glory to Jesus Christ.